Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Herding Squirrels, a podcast about modern teams and change. Today, we're welcoming Stephen Szypulski. Stephen leads post-acquisition integration at Fitch Learning, part of Fitch Group and Hearst Corporation, where the business serves more than 100,000 learners across over 100 countries. Before Fitch, he held senior roles at Bank of New York and Goldman Sachs, working on acquisitions including GreenSky and United Capital. Stephen partners with management teams to integrate organizations, align commercial priorities, and build operating models that scale. Welcome, Stephen!
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it. Glad to be here.
We're excited to have you. So before we jump in, we'd love to know, you've been working in the M&A space for a while. What got you into M&A, and what keeps you in it? What do you like about the work that you're doing?
Yeah, and thanks again. Good question. Really great to be here. I don't think anyone goes to school with a degree of M&A or coming out hoping to be an M&A. And for my own personal journey, it was very randomly. I went to school for politics, thought I was going to be in financial services for a year or two, and then go back to DC, which I care about policy. And so, early on in my career, I ended up at Goldman, thought I was going to be there for a year or two, ended up staying almost a decade, getting involved in some, pretty high-profile integration projects. And one of the cool things about integration, from my perspective, is, integrations are oftentimes good impetuses for transformations within an organization. And so integration just cuts across all different types of functions and geographies and product lines. And so for me, it's just always been really incredible to see an organization go from A to Z or A to M and see it along the journey. But, once again, integration is very dynamic. It's changing, by the year. So I'm hoping we'll get into some of that now.
Yeah, absolutely. And honestly, exactly why we're talking about integration on Herding Squirrels is, right, as we look at teams and we look at change, like, what is more chaotic than integration, right? It's such a wild, wild west, and every space is different than the next one, right? And so I guess to really jump in, what is it like going through that initial kind of announcement, and what do most leaders get wrong in those first 72 hours? Like, what is that initial point of, like, when the change is announced and things happen?
Yeah, a great question. I think, there's a couple of things, right? There's a lot of planning that can go into the deal and actually getting up to go live, you could say, of the acquisition, right? Whether you're acquiring a large company, it also depends on the types of assets you're acquiring, right? Historically, lots of companies were acquired with human capital, physical assets, capital assets, right? That's changing a little bit with AI, and a lot of acquisitions in the future in the corporate development lifecycle will probably be more data, systems, process, product type of integrations. But leading up to day one, right, you have an idea how everything's going to go, and then once the acquisition actually occurs, you have to execute. And so the realization of the deal becomes the hard part, because in the actual deal analysis and the economics of it, right, you have a rough understanding of the targets you want to hit, either financially or operationally, clients you want to achieve, new markets you want to go into, but actually executing that, I think, is the art and the science of integration.
Timeline versus reality. Like, integration plans usually look very clean on paper. Like, back to that recipe, what usually breaks first? Like, what's the first thing that kind of comes up as the red flag or red light in some of the integrations that you've been a part of?
Yeah, and a great question. And, I think just kind of jumping on, the framing of your conversation, right? Oftentimes people think like integrations are check the box types of exercises, right? You have, 50, 60 things that need to be checked. And then after those things have been checked, integration is complete. And I think that oversimplifies, what you say is a very chaotic recipe, right? Integration should be dynamic. They should be modified over time. You can have a project plan. You can have phases of an integration that you want to go through, certain outcomes and accomplishments you want to hit. But at the end of the day, challenges are going to pop up. I think most things, historically speaking, don't surface until the actual acquisition occurs. Data rooms are fully open, right? You may have a working idea of how a business or a product is before you get into the close, but building a true 360 view of a company and team, the people, the business, the clients, the operations, really only happens after the deal happens. And so one thing I think that really surfaces pretty immediately is human capital challenges, right? How people operated, how teams worked under a previous regime or leadership team or management team or whatever you want to call it, doesn't always translate into the new business or the new environment. Even if you think you're acquiring a company with a relatively similar culture, it's hard to measure that going into the deal. And so post-close, right, processes are really difficult to understand. You understand how the business works at a high level, but the real intricacies, how escalations work, how teams collaborate within the department, can really surface. A couple other things, right? Commercial distraction really doesn't occur in deal models, right? So when you're planning for the economics of a deal, you don't really think about, how the humans on the other side of the execution are actually going to operate. And client-facing teams, whether it's sales, customer success professionals, they slow down during integration. And so this isn't just because they don't want to produce money or they don't want to sell, but roles get shifted, products change, the way the business operates changes during an acquisition. And so I bring it back to kind of the art of integration, which is helping organizations execute in the right velocity, right? How do you move fast enough to realize the deal without pushing the organization into too much shock that it becomes disorder?
Oh, there's so much to dig into there, Stephen. I'm just furiously writing notes here. The first thing that you mentioned that I'd love to double click on a little bit is you mentioned that culture is hard to measure. How do you look at it ahead of time? What can you look at? What aspects of it, because to your point, right? At some point, you just have to smash it together and see how it kind of comes. But there's some pieces you have to look at ahead of time. So what do you do, and how do you look at that ahead of time?
There's a number of ways that you can look at it, right? You get an understanding of the management team and how the business or the product or the team has historically been managed, right? So some of that is, through the financials. Some of that's depending on it's a public company or private company. How has the organization responded to changes in the past? Is there significant attrition and turnover? What do employees say about their own organization, right? These are things that aren't always measurable in very tangible ways into a model, but at the same time give you a good indication of how the company operates. Geography, countries, nations play a particular incentive, right, of how employees operate within a framework, a regulatory framework. Depends on the industry and the sector too as well. Financial services and highly regulated businesses by nature have different cultures of escalation and risk tolerance than consumer products or logistics type businesses. You do interviews with employees, and I think at a human capital level, right, depending on the deal, there's some level of transparency in performance reviews and how employees have historically been managed within a company. But when you're doing these types of deals, obviously, if it's human capital dependent, right, one of the things that you want to think about is key dependency risk, right? People take vacations, people leave, switch jobs, and so having a good understanding of how cultures respond during periods of change or transformation is really helpful to understand what you're buying, what are you actually getting in the deal.
And are there any signals that you find ahead of time on how cultures respond to chaos, massive change? What type of things can you look for? And I think I want to point out one thing too here that maybe is I want to make sure we're not assuming everyone knows. Generally in a deal, the team, you don't get to talk to the team beforehand. You get to see whatever's on paper. It's not like you can go and say, let's go figure out how we work together before we make the deal. That's not possible. You're sort of behind closed doors looking at only the data that's available. So knowing that, I just want to clarify that for our listeners, knowing that you kind of have, right, you only have the information that's available to you, how might you ascertain, I would go back to what you said there, on how these cultures might handle, right, chaos and large transformational change?
Yeah, great question, and you're right. Deal teams are ring-fenced from the actual specifics of the company, so whether it's client list or if it's vendors or contracts or different specifications of the business, right, that is all separated, and you have a good idea going into the deal as a part of the diligence phase, but you never really know what you get until you get to the other side.
I'm sorry, you said ring-fenced? Is that like a prison?
No, you're cordoned off. You're cordoned off. There are appropriate barriers and walls depending on the regulated industry, right? That there's a clear separation between what's public and private information in the deal.
Okay.
But that being said about an organization ability to absorb shock or transformation, right? I think it's dependent on the sector, right? Some sectors are are more predisposed to moving with markets and moving with big changes, receptive to technological changes and innovation, right? Certain people, right, depending on geographies or experiences or skill sets, are more prone to innovation in a lot of ways, especially if you're acquiring a lot of tech and engineers and product-heavy type of capital and knowledge. But you should also look at the history of the organization itself, right? Change is happening at all periods, whether it's war, geopolitical events, market events, just innovations within a particular sector. And so looking at the history of the organization, both the financials, the operationals, how it itself has evolved as an organization, gives you some type of forecast. It may not be perfect, but it gives you some indication of how future changes may pair up to it.
Awesome. So there are signals that exist that at least give you some fence posts to look at and say, well, based off of previous, right, challenges, changes, we believe this is our hypothesis moving forward.
Yeah, and I think also, once again, depending on the circumstance in the deal, the acquiring organization or the merging organization brings a level of resources that they think can help the organization adapt to transformation, right? So even if a previous organization maybe isn't the most innovative of its kind, maybe the acquiring company says, well, with the right management or the right resources or the right geographies and physical assets, we can help guide and be a shepherd through this transformation. And so that could be part of it as well, too. And that could be part of the value capture as well. That's the value proposition as well. They don't currently have that. We can bring that to them together as a unified company. We deliver X.
Yeah. So what are some best practices, right? So again, right, just setting the stage, right? All of this work has been done by the deal team, and it's like, okay, now we have this handshake, and then suddenly the companies are like, hey, guess what? Like, right, it's like almost like a surprise party. Not for some people, I imagine, right? Very, very chaotic, uncertainty of the future, what happens next. What are some best practices to walk into that, and then to really help people and, like you said, shepherd them along throughout this journey of, again, what may be a lot of uncertainty, because all these recipes, all these plans are going to come to fruition, and there's going to be some chaos.
Yeah, and I like that word chaos because I think at the core of it, besides being a shepherd of timing, right? Integration is really about bringing structure to chaos. It is creating guardrails. It is creating decision frameworks. It's shepherding the velocity of the organization, right? Helping the organization execute on its combined goals in a very structured way. And so one thing I think best practice-wise for integration is a incremental and a phased approach, right? On day one of the deal, you don't try and shepherd the strategy into execution mode overnight. You have to understand the business, the people, and its history. And so another thing in the deal is, time is often oversimplified in a deal model, right? Outcomes are forecasted in very clean phases in diligence as a whole, right? I'm oversimplifying, but executing the deal within those pre-planned timelines is extremely difficult. And so, especially if you want to do the deal right, many decisions can't be unwound. And so integrations are by their nature very progressive. And so going in a phased, incremental, piece-by-piece approach is, in my opinion, a very smart way to handle integrations. I think I also brought up the aspect of velocity, right? How much can an organization do to speed up and execute without shocking the system? I think another thing is just culture building, right? I think during deals, right, when this comes back to the question about people, is how do you bring clarity and communication and transparency to cultures that have a lot of question marks? And I think acquisitions or divestitures or mergers, you can't really fully grasp how the culture operates, where the power sits in an old organization and a new organization overnight. And so you have to really let culture develop organically. You can't create it overnight. And so that, I think, are just some things that I think are best practices when going into any organization. Let the culture develop organically with some guidance, and don't oversimplify the timing. Be flexible with how the integration unfolds over a period of time.
Yeah, well, because right, and I think I want to go back to what you mentioned earlier when you were talking about commercial distraction, right? Is that there's going to be a natural slowdown. There's going to be a natural pause and like, what do I do right now, right? What does my day-to-day look like? Who am I reporting to? and then each individual has that question, right? And depending on the size of the organization, and also depending on the size of the organization of right, who's coming together, knowing that, right, you have all these folks going through that challenging space, and you're saying making time and making space for the culture building. What are some things that either the integration team or the company that is right bringing in this new team, what are some things that they can do to make that easier, make it more efficient? As I know you said, give it some time, but what other things have you seen that work?
Right. Yeah, I think there are a number of ways that have to be shaped depending on the organization, the phase, and right. I'm giving all these nuances to integration because I think an integration plan and integration timeline should be shaped around the particular deal, not as a blanket one-size-fits-all to any type of M&A. So that's just my kind of caveat. I think transparency and communication from the very top is number one important. So whether that's the integration leader, the CEO, the leadership team has to have buy-in into the deal and to what needs to occur in the deal for integration to be valued by employees of all levels, right? And so that's consistently channeling the same communication about why X, Y, and Z is important, why this priority is important, why this timeline that we're working under is important. When most leaders think about integration, at least at the corporate level, it's usually thought of at the financial level, right? This is the deal, this is what we have to achieve, this is by when we have to achieve these, or we'd like to achieve these financials. But there are synergies baked into the deals. But the paths to those synergies and those outcomes are executed boots on the ground, right? The day-to-day employee. And so integration becomes very nuanced, right? It's about personalities. It's about how teams work with each other. It's about leadership transitions, whether individuals fully transition over from the acquired company or if they don't, the cultural dynamics of an organization. And so this is all to say that good communication helps things a lot of the way. I think also another thing is about really getting clear about what you don't know. It's okay to have integration unknowns that get figured out along the way. And throughout the deal process, you bake into the time frame allowance to uncover, to do your own diligence, to understand processes, to really ask good questions before you start making decisions that sometimes cannot be unwound.
That's all fantastic. I mean, transparency, communication, and I really enjoy the being clear about what you don't know, because there's so many unknowns. Back to your point on every integration is different. It's all going to depend on the companies, the people. There's so much nuance involved in it that we don't know what this looks like. One of the big challenges that I'm hearing in learning more about this space is retaining top talent, is retaining good people because of a lot of the unknowns. Deal gets announced and suddenly I don't know what my future is. If I'm really good, I might be able to go get something very quickly. How do you account for retention and keeping top talent to make sure you're not losing that key knowledge that is probably part of why you did the deal in the first place?
Yeah, absolutely. And once again, it depends on the deal, because some deals, the purpose is to acquire the intellectual property, right? The understanding of a particular market, the understanding of a client base, a particular geography, or a consumer product or a process, right? And so oftentimes you are acquiring that, and so you want to bring that along, you want to extract that value, and you want to put that value to work. There's a couple of things, right? There's incentives, right? That can be purely, a company acquires another company and we give incentives for those employees to stay on. That could be other forms of the carrot, right? That could be promotions, it could be team opportunities, it could be continuity of the exact same role. And so there are ways to contractually build that into a deal that the lawyers are much better at than I am. And then there are the soft ways of doing it, which is, do you value these employees? Do you show them that you value them? Are you creating space for them in the new organization? Maybe not in the exact same role or team, but are there ways to contribute your skills and your knowledge institutionally, product, or otherwise in this new world? And so that becomes really part of it as well, too. I think there are risk mitigation aspects of this as well, too, which is, you try and mitigate the loss of that IP, right? As I mentioned earlier, people take vacations, switch roles, and so making sure that a deal isn't dependent on one singular individual or team across the organization giving people the opportunity to become leaders in a new organization, right? New leadership, new management, new ways of operating, new cultures provides a tremendous amount of opportunity for individuals, even if the company and the name is changing.
You've been doing this for a while, and
Yeah.
you've seen quite a few integrations. What type of advice would you give to someone starting this kind of work that you've earned through your experience?
One thing I think that's really interesting, and I mentioned it earlier, is like integration touches every aspect about a business, right? It's part understanding the product, understanding the clients, understanding the technical nuances of operational processes. It's understanding the financials, right? What are the targets you have to hit, or where's the business trying to go? But I truly do believe that this work at the core of it is relationship building and relationship management, right? How do you deal with different cultures, different ways of talking about businesses, different functions? What are the priorities? How do you achieve those priorities? How do you encourage teams to work towards a common goal? How do you define that common goal? And so, yes, having an understanding of different businesses and processes and ways of uniting a team is really important. But I think at the end of the day, can you speak with a junior level employee about a particular challenge? Can you then communicate that up to the C-suite about how the deal is coming at a high level? And so for me, that's kind of been what I've leaned into the most, which is how can I get into the weeds while at the same time stepping back and understanding the macro level of a deal. I think it's also really important because a lot of companies are acquired by subsidiaries, right? And so what is the parent company or the holding company's actual mission and vision for this particular unit? And so understanding how integration fits into the bigger picture, I think, has always been really helpful. And so I'm just really lucky to have ended up with some interesting experiences that touch a lot of parts of the world and business.
So there's a stat out there, and I want to say this was put out by, I believe it was BCG, but that something around 70% of M&A activity fails to hit the targets that are outlined. And one of the big majority reasons, the biggest reason why, is the people aspect is not necessarily taken into account. Why do you think that is?
Well, humbly speaking, but just based on my experience, I'm not an academic, nor have I worked at BCG. But I think, if you look at the history of kind of how integration as a practice has evolved, right? Historically, you would take two companies in corporate development, you squish them together, you overlay them with a unified management team. There would be some synergies, either operational, headcount, and then the business would kind of go on, operate. There wouldn't be a whole lot of oversight into the execution of the integration, right? Integration wasn't really a concept. I think integration nowadays in 2026 is fundamentally a PE move in a lot of ways, right? Operating partners, integration leads are operating partners who work alongside management teams across functions. They use transformation and change to deliver new ways of operating and driving and creating value within an organization. And so I think it's also just by nature of how integration as a philosophy has evolved, or as a practice has evolved, right? Historically, people probably realized that they were losing a lot of value in the deal, either because people were leaving or you weren't tapping enough productivity out of the teams. And so my educated guess is that it's probably just seen as a way of preventing deal loss and deal leakage, where we can get a little bit more out of it now.
Yeah. You talked about using the terms of change, of transformation, and we're in a space with AI where it seems like every organization is going through some massive level of change, of transformation. What advice would you give other people leading change and transformation, maybe not necessarily integration, but that you've learned from, again, doing this really difficult change work that they might be able to use in their companies as they transform looking forward?
Yeah, great question. And I'm glad you brought up AI, and I promise to your audience I did not plant the seed to talk about it, so I'm glad it came up organically. But, I've been thinking a lot about how integration relates to AI enablement in the workforce nowadays and kind of what that means for integrations. And, introducing AI into an organization requires integrating systems, data, workflow, governance, decision-making, just like any traditional acquisition or merger. And so, I alluded to it earlier, but I think, going forward, from this day, AI is going to force integration at systems level and process level. And so, yes, humans will be involved, and yes, humans will be orchestrating a lot of these systems and processes, but the execution layer may not exactly be the same as it was historically, right? Humans become orchestrators. And so really the role of integration becomes designing, governing, interpreting these systems and frameworks of a whole organization, right? Rather than executing each step manually, function by function, silo by silo, geography by geography. And so advice going forward, I don't know, I think it's an evolving practice. I'm still learning every day. I think each deal, each integration teaches you something new and new nuances about approaching. And so for me, it just becomes learning by doing and trying and getting better each time you do it.
I love it. I love it. Fantastic. Yeah, it sounds like AI is going to make it both more simple in some ways and maybe more complex in others. It seems to be the ongoing news of AI is that it's some things are a little bit easier and some things are a little bit more challenging. So we'll see where that goes and pay attention to that road as we travel down it. Fantastic, Steven. This has been absolutely wonderful.
Thank you. I appreciate it. I love this discussion.
If our listeners want to find more of you, or they want to find you somewhere on the internet, where can we find more Steven?
I think LinkedIn is perfect. LinkedIn/Steven Szypulski.
Perfect. Well, we'll put that in our show notes, so if you want to find Steven, his link will be there. Otherwise, thank you so much for joining us, Steven. It's been a fantastic conversation. So much knowledge and ideas coming out.
I'm so grateful. Thanks, Brandon.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks, everyone, for joining us again. This is Herding Squirrels, where we uncover the nuts and bolts of teams.